Have you ever watched an arrogant leader throw the only parachute out of a flying plane because it took up too much room? That is exactly what the new executive did when he fired me. He thought I was just a quiet data engineer taking up space. He had no idea I was the only safety lock keeping an empire worth tens of millions of dollars from collapsing. Stick around because the final checkmate will give you chills. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no operating budget to keep bringing you these narratives. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive true revenge stories that are even longer, featuring incredibly detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join our community by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the link in the video description or pinned comment below. Now, let us dive right into today's story, brought to you from the perspective of our main character, Reagan Green. It was a crisp Friday morning at the Chicago headquarters of Vanguard Freight Technologies. We were a massive corporate entity specializing in medical transport coordination software, a complex web of logistics that kept life-saving supplies moving safely across the country. The air in the office was usually a steady hum of quiet productivity, driven by engineers and data analysts focused entirely on their screens. But that day, a new kind of abrasive energy disrupted the floor. Our newly appointed Chief Financial Officer, Marcus Sterling, had decided it was the perfect day to make his grand authoritative mark on the company culture. Marcus was exactly the type of person you would picture when someone says the words startup prodigy. He was a man who wore custom-fitted suits that cost more than my car, slicked his dark hair back with an aggressive amount of expensive gel, and was hopelessly addicted to throwing around hollow corporate buzzwords. Every time he opened his mouth, it was a relentless word salad of phrases like artificial intelligence optimization, synergy, and breaking down legacy barriers. He operated under the dangerous delusion that sheer volume equated to intelligence and that intimidation was the exact same thing as leadership. I was sitting at my usual desk in the center of the main server quadrant, sipping my morning tea. I am Reagan Green, 34 years old, holding the rather obscure title of Chief Compliance Data Architect. For the past 8 years, I had been a permanent fixture in that office. I was known primarily for two things: my endless collection of oversized gray knitted sweaters and my thick wire-rimmed round glasses. In nearly a decade of high-pressure software deployments, no one had ever heard me raise my voice. I strongly preferred the predictable company of code and strict compliance protocols over the messy, exhausting theater of office politics. But that morning, Marcus strode into the server area with the subtlety of a marching band. He did not bother stopping at his own glass office. Instead, he marched right up to my workstation and called out my name so loudly that the ambient noise of the cooling fans seemed to instantly vanish. "Reagan Green," he announced, projecting his voice so aggressively that every single one of the 40 employees in the open plan space stopped typing, took off their headphones, and turned to watch. He did not ask for a private meeting in a conference room. He did not send an email to human resources. He wanted a brutal public execution to show everyone exactly who was in charge of this new regime. "Effective immediately, your employment at Vanguard Freight Technologies is terminated," he declared, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms. He then launched into a highly theatrical monologue about how I was a relic of the old generation. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me, accusing me of deliberately slowing down critical medical shipments with my outdated, manual compliance review processes. "We are moving into a hyper-agile future," he proclaimed to the completely silent room, ensuring his voice reached the furthest cubicles. "We simply cannot afford dead weight holding back our transit times and our profit margins. Pack up your desk. I want you out of this building in 10 minutes. The silence that followed his speech was heavy and suffocating. 40 pairs of eyes darted nervously between Marcus and me. I knew exactly what they were expecting. They expected me to burst into tears, to frantically beg for my job, or at least to mount a furious, screaming defense of my 8 years of flawless service to the company. I did none of those things. Instead, I slowly reached up and took off my round glasses, folding the metal arms with deliberate, practiced precision. I looked up at Marcus. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, fear, or humiliation. Looking at his smug, grinning face, all I felt was a profound, icy pity. I looked at him the exact way a weary adult looks at a foolish toddler who has somehow gotten their hands on a live hand grenade and is gleefully pulling the pin, completely oblivious to the destruction they are about to unleash. I let a very small, soft smile touch the corners of my mouth. I did not say a single word in my defense. I simply turned back to my monitor, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with rapid ease as I initiated a secure wipe of my personal local storage partitions. Once the format was complete and the screen went black, I reached around to the back of the computer tower and gripped my personal YubiKey security dongle. I pulled it free from the port, feeling the cold, smooth metal in my palm, and dropped it securely into my leather tote bag. I stood up, pushed my chair in neatly under the desk, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked straight out of the server room. The digital clock on the wall read exactly 11:45 in the morning. As I walked toward the glass elevator banks, I could hear Marcus behind me, his voice booming as he bragged to the stunned employees about the incredible new era of speed he had just ushered in, entirely unaware of the catastrophic countdown he had just set in motion. Marcus was an expert in spreadsheets, but he was profoundly illiterate in the actual mechanics of the company he was supposed to manage. He saw trucks as simple boxes on wheels and software, as nothing more than lines on a budget sheet. He had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Freight did not just transport basic commercial goods. Our entire business model relied on hauling highly restricted specialty pharmaceuticals, dangerous chemical compounds, and extremely sensitive medical supplies. Because of this, every single route we operated fell under the direct, uncompromising jurisdiction of the United States Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Department of Transportation. In our industry, you do not just load a trailer and drive onto the interstate. The federal government requires absolute real-time monitoring of every highly regulated chemical shipment. To comply with this, every single delivery truck waiting at our dispatch gates across the nation had to pass through a continuous, automated digital screening process. Our core dispatch program had to send an encrypted request through a dedicated application programming interface gateway, connecting directly to the federal government's secure servers. This connection validated the specific route, verified the hazardous materials licenses, and provided a real-time federal transport clearance before a truck was legally allowed to turn its ignition key and leave the warehouse lot. If that digital gateway failed to respond for even a fraction of a second, the entire logistics network would immediately freeze to prevent a massive federal violation. My role at Vanguard went far deeper than simply monitoring the daily traffic on that system. 5 long years ago, the corporation underwent a chaotic, incredibly messy merger with a major competitor. During that transition, our legacy corporate servers were completely wiped, and the official institutional security credentials connecting us to the Federal Transit Registry were accidentally corrupted. We were facing a catastrophic shutdown and millions of dollars in daily federal fines because the corporate paperwork would take months to reprocess through the bureaucratic channels. To save the company from immediate financial ruin, the previous administration desperately asked me to find a workaround. I possessed a rare personal Level 4 federal security clearance certificate, which I had earned independently through years of specialized defense logistics consulting. To keep the company alive, I manually linked my own personal federal security token to our main database framework, creating a temporary digital bridge that allowed Vanguard to route its transport requests under my individual license. It was meant to be a short-term fix for a couple of weeks. However, the previous board of directors realized that my personal setup operated flawlessly, completely eliminating their regulatory headache without costing them a single extra dollar. They quietly decided to leave the configuration exactly as it was, entirely sweeping the dependency under the rug. My personal, highly encrypted digital signature became the permanent, solitary foundation maintaining the federal transportation compliance for the entire corporation. When Marcus forced me to pack my things and walk out of that building, his frantic desire for a dramatic show of power blinded him to the basic physics of our network architecture. The moment I yanked my personal physical YubiKey out of the primary console terminal, the secure hardware link that fed my Level 4 federal clearance into the Vanguard network was physically severed. The corporate servers immediately lost their valid authorization profile. Deep within the automated defense monitoring systems of the Federal Compliance Registry, an unblinking, hard-coded security protocol was instantly triggered. Because the system was designed to handle temporary network flickers or brief maintenance windows, it did not shut us down on a Friday afternoon. Instead, the federal servers quietly initiated an automated 48-hour countdown. The clock began ticking down towards a complete system isolation. And because Marcus had forbidden the IT department from monitoring legacy compliance logs, absolutely no one remaining in that glass tower had any clue that the fuse had been lit. By the time I reached my quiet apartment on the north side of the city, the afternoon sun was beginning to filter through the blinds. I did not experience a single moment of panic. I did not rush to my desk to polish my resume, nor did I reach out to corporate recruiters on professional networking sites. I felt an incredible sense of relief as I casually hung up my coat and walked into the kitchen. I patiently brewed a hot mug of chamomile tea, letting the soothing aroma fill the room, and walked over to my kitchen table with my personal laptop. I flipped the screen open, bypassed my standard accounts, and logged directly into my private, off-grid monitoring dashboard that tracked my personal federal clearance telemetry. The interface was entirely clean, except for a massive, glowing red notification flashing across the center of my screen. The warning read exactly, "Alert. Secure hardware link terminated. Federal Network Isolation Protocol initiated. Full system freeze will commence at 12:01 a.m. on Monday morning." I took a slow, calm sip of my tea, closed the laptop lid, and decided to enjoy my weekend. Monday morning arrived with an air of completely unjustified triumph in the executive suite of Vanguard Freight Technologies. Marcus strolled into the weekly board of directors meeting acting as if he had just personally cured a global disease. He was wearing another incredibly expensive tailored suit, radiating a toxic level of smug confidence. He had spent his entire weekend preparing a ridiculously flashy slideshow presentation, completely filled with meaningless graphs, aggressive transition effects, and massive bold fonts. He clicked his wireless remote to project a giant pie chart onto the wall. With a wide, arrogant smile, he proudly declared to the room of senior executives that his decisive leadership action of eliminating my position had successfully optimized their workflow. He boasted that by removing the manual compliance bottlenecks I supposedly represented, the internal network processing speed had instantly increased by exactly 40%. He stood there, basking in his own imagined glory, completely oblivious to the fact that the system was running faster simply because it was no longer processing any actual federal security checks. He was right in the middle of a long, rambling sentence about maximizing vertical synergy when the fragile illusion of his success violently shattered. The chief operating officer, a notoriously stern man who rarely showed emotion, felt his mobile phone vibrate intensely against the polished mahogany boardroom table. He glanced at the screen and frowned, declining the call. 5 seconds later, it rang again. Then his corporate smartwatch began buzzing relentlessly. Before he could even apologize for the interruption, the mobile phones of the vice president of sales, the head of logistics, and the chief legal counsel all erupted in a chaotic, deafening symphony of ringtones. The chief operating officer finally answered his phone, and the remaining color instantly drained from his face. Out on the interstate highways, an absolute logistical nightmare had just been unleashed. More than 300 massive refrigerated transport vehicles were suddenly paralyzed. These were not standard trucks carrying cheap retail goods. They were heavily armored medical transports, hauling tens of millions of dollars worth of highly regulated, temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, specialized chemical compounds, and life-saving surgical equipment. As the federal 48-hour grace period expired, the Central Dispatch software automatically executed its emergency compliance protocols at way stations and toll booths across the entire nation. The electronic ignition control modules inside those 300 trucks instantly locked down. The drivers were completely stranded, staring at digital dashboard screens that flashed severe federal warning messages, completely unable to even restart their engines to keep the critical refrigeration units running at optimal capacity. Down on the lower levels of the building, the information technology department had descended into pure, unadulterated panic. The main monitoring room looked like a chaotic scene from a disaster movie. Every single diagnostic monitor was flashing a blinding, urgent red. The primary federal application programming interface gateway, the vital digital bridge I had maintained silently for years, was slamming their server requests into a massive brick wall. It was returning a severe, uncompromising network error code, 403, access denied. The system was not simply blocking new delivery manifests from generating in the warehouse. It was actively rejecting all active transit licenses, immediately classifying every single Vanguard freight vehicle currently on the road as a rogue, unauthorized transport of hazardous materials. Brody, our lead network engineer, burst into the executive boardroom on the top floor. He did not even bother to knock. He practically kicked the heavy oak door open, gasping for air, his face completely pale and shining with cold sweat. He completely ignored Marcus, who was still standing awkwardly next to his presentation screen, and locked eyes directly with the chief operating officer. Brody stammered out that they were not experiencing a hardware failure, a severed fiber optic cable, or a standard software glitch. He explained to the room of horrified executives, his voice trembling with sheer terror, that the root cause of the massive blackout was incredibly specific. The required personal authorization digital certificate belonging to Reagan Green was entirely missing from the network handshake, meaning the federal government was actively rejecting their legal right to operate. The boardroom descended into shouting, but the noise was immediately silenced when the central conference telephone on the table emitted a sharp, piercing chime. It was an emergency override call from their largest, most lucrative account, a massive, highly influential private hospital network based on the East Coast. The vice president of supply chain for the hospital was on the other end, and he was screaming so loudly that the high-definition speakerphone physically distorted his voice. A critical, time-sensitive shipment of specialized heart medication was currently trapped at an inspection checkpoint right on the Ohio state border. The State Highway Patrol was threatening to forcefully impound the vehicle and arrest the driver because the digital hazmat manifest had suddenly flagged as entirely fraudulent. The hospital executive threatened to launch an immediate multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuit, promising to bury Vanguard Freight in legal fees if that truck was not moving within 15 minutes. Marcus began to sweat profusely, the slick gel in his hair rapidly losing its hold. His arrogant facade crumbled into sheer, desperate panic. Instead of admitting his catastrophic lack of foresight, he doubled down on his technical ignorance in the most spectacular way possible. He slammed both of his hands down on the boardroom table, his face flushed red with anger, and turned his absolute fury on the lead engineer. "I do not care what the error code is," Marcus screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Brody. "Just hack into the system, bypass the federal gateway right now, create a fake account, put Reagan's name on it, and force the administrative permissions through." The entire executive room went dead silent. Brody stared at the chief financial officer as if the man had just completely lost his mind. Marcus was genuinely demanding that a civilian corporate information technology team actively launch a coordinated cyber attack to forge security credentials against the United States federal government, an act that carried severe felony prison sentences, miles away from the absolute meltdown happening in the corporate tower. I was enjoying a remarkably peaceful Monday morning inside my sunlit apartment. I was wearing my most comfortable pair of thick wool socks and casually eating a warm bowl of fresh oatmeal. I had my personal laptop open on the kitchen island, but I was not frantically checking industry message boards or answering calls. I was just watching the morning local news broadcasts and enjoying my chamomile tea. Suddenly, a soft, polite chime echoed from my laptop speakers. I switched over to my secure inbox and found a newly generated automated security email sent directly from the Federal Compliance Monitoring Network. The subject line made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. It was an official, automated alert informing me that an unknown, unauthorized corporate IP address was currently making clumsy, frantic attempts to digitally forge my highly encrypted personal signature. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, smiled warmly at the glowing screen, and watched the arrogant kingdom completely destroy itself from the absolute comfort of my own home. Down in the frantic, overheated server room, Brody and his deeply terrified information technology team actually made the worst possible decision of their entire professional careers. Driven by the primal fear of losing their own jobs under the wrath of an unhinged executive, they foolishly attempted to execute Marcus's insane command. They rushed to code a makeshift script, desperately trying to bypass the primary federal gateway by spoofing a connection profile under my name. It was an incredibly amateurish maneuver, the digital equivalent of trying to break into a heavily fortified bank vault with a plastic spoon. The very millisecond they pushed those forged credentials through the external firewall, they tripped a massive, invisible tripwire deeply embedded within the Department of Homeland Security defense grid. The Federal Automated Defense Matrix did not just politely reject the unauthorized ping. It retaliated with absolute, uncompromising digital force. Within less than a minute, Vanguard Freight Technologies was officially slapped with a Level 1 data fraud classification. This was not a minor administrative penalty or a simple parking ticket type of warning. This was the exact kind of severe national security alert that immediately wakes up federal agents in Washington. The entire corporate Internet Protocol block was instantly blacklisted by the government, effectively cutting off the company from every single federal database in the country. Back up in the luxurious executive suite, the fallout from this disastrous hacking attempt was instantaneous and incredibly violent. Harper, our notoriously ruthless chief legal counsel, did not just walk into Marcus's pristine glass office. She practically tore the heavy glass door right off its custom hinges. She was carrying my physical human resources personnel file, a thick manila folder holding 8 years of flawless performance reviews and critical security authorizations. She stormed across the carpet and slammed the heavy file down onto Marcus's immaculate desk with such aggressive force that his very expensive crystal paperweight actually bounced off the edge and shattered into a dozen pieces on the hardwood floor. "You absolute, unbelievable idiot!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the open floor plan, completely abandoning any remaining sense of polite corporate decorum. "Do you have any earthly idea what you just did to us? You did not just fire a data engineer. You just fired the only living human being on this entire payroll who actually holds the legal operating license for our entire national fleet." Marcus was physically shrinking backward into his expensive leather chair. He was sweating so profusely that his custom-tailored silk shirt was practically clinging to his skin, yet, completely trapped in his own colossal, fragile ego, he still tried to deflect the blame. He began to stammer loudly, frantically waving his manicured hands in the air, loudly claiming that I had deliberately sabotaged the company network before leaving. He pointed a shaking finger at the shattered glass on the floor, angrily accusing me of playing dirty, of maliciously hiding my security credentials from the executive management team just to set an elaborate trap for him to fail. Harper let out a sharp, venomous laugh that sounded much more like a feral growl. She aggressively flipped open the thick manila file and started pulling out pages, literally throwing the documents directly at his chest. She pointed out that my specific federal security permissions and the massive architectural dependency relying on my personal hardware key were clearly documented in dozens of monthly compliance reports. These were highly detailed risk assessment reports that had been sent directly to his executive inbox every single week since the very first day he was hired. reports that he had explicitly, arrogantly ignored because they were too technical and did not contain enough colorful, optimistic charts about artificial intelligence synergy. The board of directors, who had been watching this entire humiliating meltdown unfold from the adjacent glass conference room, finally decided to intervene. The chief executive officer marched into the office, looking at Marcus with a potent mixture of pure disgust and absolute existential terror. The company was now bleeding millions of dollars in penalty fees by the hour, and the federal government was actively preparing to investigate them for corporate cyber fraud. They gave Marcus a very simple, very brutal ultimatum. He was explicitly ordered to pick up his desk phone, call the very same quiet woman he had so loudly and publicly humiliated just 3 days prior, and do whatever it took to beg her to come back. The board authorized him to offer me a brand new, ironclad employment contract with exactly double my previous annual salary, a massive, immediate signing bonus, and whatever ridiculous executive title I wanted. His only job was to convince me to walk back into that building and plug my physical security key into their server before the federal marshals arrived. From my comfortable spot on my living room couch across the city, I calmly watched my mobile phone screen light up. The caller identification boldly displayed Marcus's private direct office line. I let it ring. Then it rang again. Over the course of the next 2 agonizing hours, Marcus called my personal number exactly 14 separate times. I let every single one of those desperate calls drop straight to my automated voicemail box. I casually listened to the audio recordings as they rolled in, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular, auditory unraveling of his sanity. The very first voicemail was stiff, rigid, and commanding, with Marcus desperately trying to maintain a thin illusion of his authority, demanding that I return to the office immediately to resolve a minor, unimportant administrative oversight. By the 5th incoming call, his tone had completely shifted to a frantic, hyperventilating bargaining session, aggressively promising me a massive pay raise, stock options, and my own private corner office. By the 14th and final voicemail, the arrogant startup prodigy was completely, utterly broken. He was literally trembling, his voice actively cracking as he practically sobbed into the receiver, throwing away all of his pride and begging me to just pick up the phone and save his ruined career. All he received in return was the endless, indifferent dial tone of my voicemail system. While Marcus was having a complete nervous breakdown over the telephone, the logistical disaster was becoming an entirely public spectacle. Deeply frustrated, exhausted drivers who were stranded at highway way stations had started taking videos of their locked digital dashboards and posting the clips directly onto massive social media platforms. Pictures of frozen pharmaceutical trucks surrounded by angry state police officers were rapidly going viral. The ruthless financial sector caught wind of the devastating rumors almost immediately. Wall Street trading algorithms quickly picked up the escalating internet chatter about the stranded medical supplies and the looming federal data fraud investigation. Before the afternoon trading session even reached its peak, Vanguard freight stock began to absolutely plummet on the open exchange floor, instantly wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate market valuation in a matter of a few brutal hours. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere inside the Vanguard Freight corporate headquarters had transitioned from sheer panic to absolute, silent despair. The executive floor felt exactly like a high-end funeral home. No one was shouting into their telephones anymore. They were simply sitting in their expensive chairs, staring blankly at the walls, waiting for the inevitable execution of their entire business model. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the main ground floor lobby were forcefully pushed open. It was not returning truck drivers or angry hospital administrators walking through those doors. It was a highly coordinated federal task force, a stern, uncompromising delegation of senior investigators from the United States Department of Transportation and elite compliance inspectors from the Food and Drug Administration marched straight into the building. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, completely bypassing the frantic receptionists and heading straight for the secure executive elevator banks. They were there to conduct a full, unannounced on-site audit regarding the severe national security violations that had completely paralyzed the national medical supply chain. Up on the top floor, the board of directors and Marcus were huddled closely together inside the massive glass conference room, anxiously watching the elevator floor indicators slowly count up. They were fully expecting to face a squad of grim government agents in standard-issue windbreakers, ready to hand out massive corporate fines, seize their hard drives, and potentially issue federal arrest warrants for the entire executive leadership team. The soft chime of the arriving elevator echoed loudly through the entirely silent, carpeted hallway. The polished steel doors slid open. 4 heavily armed federal agents stepped out first, their expressions completely unreadable behind their dark sunglasses. Then, they politely stepped aside to make room for the lead technical representative of the independent auditing firm that the federal government had officially contracted to lead the entire technical investigation. I stepped out of the elevator. I was no longer wearing my oversized gray knitted sweater or my standard round wire-rimmed glasses. Instead, I was dressed in an impeccably tailored, razor-sharp black suit that cut a striking, intimidating silhouette against the sterile corporate lighting. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless arrangement, and my posture radiated an absolute, freezing authority. I walked slowly down the long corridor, the sharp click of my polished heels against the marble floor echoing like the steady ticking of a metronome counting down their final seconds of freedom. The reaction inside the glass conference room was an absolute masterpiece of human shock and devastation. Marcus physically dropped his luxury silver pen. It hit the solid mahogany table and rolled right off the edge onto the floor, but he did not even look down to see where it went. His jaw went completely slack, his eyes widening to a point where they looked like they might actually fracture from the strain. The chief executive officer looked exactly as if he had just been struck by a powerful bolt of lightning, completely paralyzed in his high-backed leather chair. They were staring at a ghost who had returned not to haunt them, but to legally and systematically dismantle their entire empire piece by piece. I walked directly into the boardroom, flanked by the federal agents, and stood confidently at the head of the table. I did not offer a polite morning greeting. I did not smile. The sheer gravity of the legal reality I brought with me instantly filled the room, completely suffocating any remaining trace of their previous corporate arrogance. The massive, fundamental secret that none of these highly paid executives had ever bothered to discover in their own paperwork was finally brought out into the open light. My personal federal Level 4 security certificate had never actually belonged to Vanguard Freight Technologies. It was not a company asset listed on their balance sheets. It was not tied to my standard employment contract. Exactly 5 years ago, when I first configured that critical digital bridge to save them from total financial ruin, I had quietly registered the security clearance under the legal umbrella of a completely separate, private limited liability company. It was a boutique cybersecurity consulting firm of which I was the sole legal owner and primary operator. For half a decade, Vanguard Freight had unknowingly been operating their multi-million-dollar logistics network entirely under the protective umbrella of my private business license. When Marcus loudly and publicly terminated my employment on that fateful Friday morning, he did not just fire a quiet data engineer. He unilaterally and aggressively severed a critical, legally binding service agreement. The very moment I walked out of that building, I simply followed standard, legally required federal protocol. I immediately submitted an official network disconnection report directly to the federal regulatory agencies, clearly documenting that my consulting firm was no longer providing secure routing oversight for the Vanguard logistics network. The federal government operates entirely on absolute compliance and expert technical analysis. When the Vanguard Information Technology team triggered that Level 1 data fraud alert with their catastrophic hacking attempt, the government agencies urgently needed an independent auditor who thoroughly understood the highly intricate architecture of that specific transport network. Since I was the undisputed architect of that exact system, the federal government had immediately signed a highly lucrative, temporary crisis contract with my private firm to lead the official regulatory investigation into Vanguard Freight. The paralyzing, Suffocating silence in the room was finally broken by Harper. The notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer suddenly looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly desperate. She stood up slowly, leaning her heavy weight against the edge of the table, completely abandoning her usual aggressive legal tactics and intimidating posture. She tried to force a warm, familiar tone, practically pleading with me to consider our shared history. "Please, we are practically begging you," Harper said, her voice shaking with genuine, unfiltered fear. "You know these people. You know this company. Think of the good old days. Think of all the years we worked together to build this network. Just plug your hardware key back in, open the federal gateway, and save this company before the government forces us to file for total bankruptcy by noon today." I looked at her without displaying a single trace of emotion or sympathy. I calmly reached into my premium leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of officially stamped government documents. I lifted my arm and let the massive file drop heavily onto the exact center of the mahogany table. The loud thud made Marcus physically flinch and shrink back into his chair. "I am not standing here right now as your former employee," I declared, my voice echoing off the glass walls with a chilling, uncompromising, metallic clarity. "I am standing here acting entirely in the official capacity of an independent federal inspector contracted directly by the United States government. There are absolutely no good old days for us to consider. Furthermore, every single frantic, amateurish attempt your team made to hack the federal system and illegally forge my digital signature on Monday afternoon has been meticulously recorded, permanently logged, and formally submitted to these specific agents standing behind me as physical, undeniable evidence of a severe federal crime." The remaining color completely drained from Marcus's face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of his former arrogant self. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable reality of his current situation. He was no longer just facing the humiliating loss of his prestigious executive job or a severe drop in the company stock price. He was staring directly down the dark barrel of a massive federal indictment, and I was the independent authority holding all the irrefutable evidence. The air in the boardroom was so thick, you could practically cut it with a knife. I stood at the head of the table, letting the terrifying reality of their situation sink in completely. I opened the heavy file I had dropped on the table and slid a newly drafted, legally binding comprehensive monitoring agreement directly across the polished wood toward the chief executive officer. I informed them, in a voice completely devoid of any warmth or flexibility, that the federal lockdown on their fleet would only be lifted upon the immediate execution of this specific contract with my private auditing firm. The terms were no longer based on the modest salary of a quiet data engineer. I was now dictating the survival price of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I clearly outlined the new financial structure. My private firm required a fixed, non-negotiable retainer of $150,000 every single month simply to maintain the protective digital signature over their federal gateway. In addition to that base fee, any mandatory on-site compliance inspections or system audits would be billed at a strict rate of $10,000 per hour. The chief financial officer, who had previously obsessed over saving pennies by eliminating my position, was now staring at a financial hemorrhage that would cost the corporation millions. But the money was merely a secondary punishment. The true cost of their arrogance was written in bold ink on the very last page of the contract. It was a mandatory, non-negotiable prerequisite clause for my services. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of the chief executive officer and stated my final demand. The individual entirely responsible for the disastrous, unauthorized termination procedure and the subsequent illegal cyber attack orders against the federal government had to be removed from the premises immediately. Marcus Sterling was to be terminated with absolute cause, completely stripping him of any golden parachute, stock options, or executive severance packages. Marcus completely lost whatever remained of his mind. He leaped out of his chair, his face turning a chaotic shade of purple, and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He frantically looked around the long mahogany table, desperately locking eyes with the other executives, begging them to fight back. demanding that they call their legal teams or negotiate a better deal. But there was no salvation to be found. The chief executive officer did not say a single word to him. He simply turned his head and gave a slow, deliberate nod to the head of corporate security standing near the door. Within seconds, two massive security guards stepped forward, grabbed Marcus by both of his custom-tailored arms, and physically dragged him out of the boardroom. His frantic screams echoed down the long hallway until the heavy elevator doors completely severed the sound, marking the abrupt, humiliating end of his brief and disastrous reign. With the screaming finally gone, a profound, heavy silence fell over the remaining board members. The chief executive officer reached out with a trembling hand, took his premium fountain pen, and hastily signed his name on the dotted line of my contract. He pushed the document back toward me, his eyes entirely defeated. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved my personal physical security key. I walked over to the central command computer built right into the boardroom console and plugged the small metal device into the port. I typed in my highly encrypted sequence and clicked the mouse exactly one time. Instantly, the massive projection screen on the wall refreshed. The terrifying red error codes vanished, replaced by a sea of healthy green indicators, thousands of miles away, across the entire United States. The electronic ignition systems inside hundreds of stranded transport trucks simultaneously unlocked. The dashboard lights illuminated, the engines roared back to life, and the vital flow of medical supplies instantly resumed. I let a small, polite smile cross my face as I looked at the defeated, silent row of executives. I neatly gathered my signed contract and my documents, placed them securely back into my briefcase, and turned toward the door. I walked out of that room, leaving behind an absolute, terrified silence. They finally understood the catastrophic danger of underestimating the quiet people who actually hold the keys to the kingdom. 10 minutes later, I pushed through the revolving glass doors on the ground floor and stepped out into the brilliant, warming sunlight of downtown Chicago. The city noise felt incredibly refreshing. I walked over to a high-end artisanal cafe on the corner, ordered their most expensive, elaborately crafted coffee, and took a slow, highly satisfying sip. Just as the warm liquid hit my tongue, my mobile phone chimed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an automated alert from my private business bank account, confirming a successful, immediate wire transfer of exactly $500,000 for the initial retainer advance. I smiled up at the clear blue sky, knowing that the best revenge is always built on a foundation of undeniable competence. Thank you so much to every single one of you for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey of corporate justice satisfying, please help us keep the channel alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our very best, completely exclusive, true revenge stories that feature highly detailed situations and incredible multi-voice acting that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can support us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by simply clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment.